Okay, so let's transition to talking about emotions in the brain. And I actually thought we would kick it off by talking about one of my favorite neuropsychiatric disorders, which is a disorder called the Capgras delusion. So this is going to sound like science fiction, but I promise you it is very real. So the Capgras delusion occurs in individuals who have had brain damage who believe that their loved ones have been replaced by imposters. Okay. So I put this little icon up. I don't really know how else to show it. But the idea is that if you're a patient with the Capgras delusion, you would be in, your hospital room after, let's say, an accident. And when your spouse comes in, you're like, wait, what's going on? Like, that's not my spouse. They look like my spouse. They talk like my spouse. They know secrets that only my spouse knows, but something's not right. This is not my spouse. And actually, it turns out the secret thing is a big thing. If you're like, Michael, it's me. Like, here's some secrets. We met here. Our first date was there. I'd be like, wait, how do you know all this? This is creeping me out. This isn't funny anymore. How do you know all that? And it is a very actually well-established neuropsychiatric condition. Why I'm telling you about this in a lecture on emotions, you'll see in 1 second. It sometimes leads to violence, particularly in bed in the middle of the night, because something that can happen is that a person will go to sleep. They'll like kind of accept that that is their partner, but they'll go to sleep, and in their sleepiness, they will think there is a stranger in their bed with them. They get spooked and they attack them, push them out of the bed, and so on and so forth. Sometimes they'll try to do tricks to kind of play along, as it were, but that actually doesn't help for too long. If you do things like, oh, you were right, that was an imposter, but now the real person's here. Like for maybe a few minutes, they might believe you, but then after a few minutes, they're like, wait, you're lying to me again. Why did you do that? You didn't replace, you're still the same person. You didn't, you're not the original. And actually, interestingly enough, it can sometimes occur for even pets or inanimate objects of really great personal significance. There's this really heartbreaking story of this guy who has the Capgras delusion. He finally gets out of the hospital. He doesn't want to be around any of the people who claim to be his family. He's so lonely. He just talks about how he wants to go home. He finally gets home. His dog runs up to him and he just collapses on the ground because he starts crying. And he's like, they even got my dog. This isn't my dog. Where is my dog? And so it can really happen for things that are just very emotionally salient to you. And so that's an important word, emotional salience, because it's been thought that it's caused by a decrease in the autonomic or limbic responses that differentiate between familiar emotional kind of items. Because it actually turns out that for all of us, whenever we see our loved ones, our parents, our family members, our siblings, children we care about, and so on and so forth, there's actually a sort of subliminal, subconscious limbic response that's kind of a little extra oomph in our brain that's kind of tagging people and things that we care about that's not there for people we don't care about. And you can actually measure this with a thing that's called a galvanic skin response or skin conductance. It's a really simple task, and it's a way that you can measure just like basically a little bit of sweat, because it's like, hey, I'm excited, this is good. Sometimes it can be measured for things that are threatening, but in this case, it's for things that are good. And so what you can do is you can look at skin conductance, or how much they're sweating, and that's what we're going to plot here on the vertical axis. And we're going to do it for healthy individuals for which there's no problem whatsoever. And what we see is something like this. You see an increase in skin conductance for familiar faces of people you care about versus unfamiliar faces. And in people who are psychiatric controls, who might have schizophrenia or bipolar, but who don't have the Capgras delusion, you see something very, very similar. But then in Capgras patients, you actually see that their limbic system does not differentiate between familiar and unfamiliar faces. And it's thought that this is what's driving the delusion, that they see, for example, their mother, and they'll be like, something's not right, something's missing. And what that thing is missing is this sort of subliminal, subconscious, limbic emotional response that you're not even necessarily aware of. And for whatever reason, a compensatory mechanism, the brain compensates, compensatory, it doesn't matter. The brain compensates by going to a delusion of you've been replaced by an imposter, probably because they can't really come up with another story altogether. And so I like to start with this story because I think it shows that emotions are more than just the everyday feelings of life. They dictate our choices. They play a role in our moods. They can lead to these kind of really paranoid delusions if they're absent. And actually, disorders of emotions are common in many, many psychiatric and neurological and abnormal psych type of situations. So let's spend a little bit of time talking about how we understand emotion in the brain. And I do have to be honest, much like with social neuroscience, it's a very young field. And so we don't have as many major theories to kind of combine them. So I thought I'd pick a couple of sub cases and we'd explore them in depth, sort of like what we did in social neuroscience. And in particular, I wanted to talk about the amygdala some more, because there's some fascinating aspects about it I haven't told you yet, which again, we've talked about is involved in many different sorts of emotional processing and emotional memories, but specifically with things like agitation, anxiety, and fear. So it turns out that if you look at a person's amygdala and you show them a frightened face, a neutral face, and a house, just right off the bat, you can see that the amygdala will be the most active for the feel for face relative to the neutral face. This is just a tried and true aspect of the amygdala. So it's not even necessarily just fear that you yourself are experiencing, but fear that you're perceiving in others. I mean, it actually turns out that you can look at fear as a modulation in people who have very particular phobias. So for example, in this particular graph that I'm showing you here, we can see what the amygdala is doing when you are scared of something in particular. So for example, if you have arachnophobia, so you're scared of a spider versus, a control like a butterfly, you can see that the amygdala is going to be much more active for the thing you're scared of than the thing you're not scared of. Whereas if it's something that could be scary to other people, like, some people are scared of like snakes or, I don't know, other frightening phobic things. Some people are afraid of clowns, but if these patients themselves are not afraid of clowns, you're not going to see any difference. And then when it's a neutral stimulus, a car, a house, whatever, again, the amygdala doesn't really seem to care very much. So it actually seems like the amygdala is also giving you a sense of, oh, this is why, if someone in the class is arachnophobic or scared of clowns or scared of snakes or scared of flying, any of these things, you could just look at their amygdala and get a sense of what it is exactly that is unique to them and their particular phobias. So then what happens if you stimulate the amygdala of an individual? Okay, so what happens if you artificially turn the amygdala on in an individual? So in this case here, this is from a person who was having ECOG, and this is a slice of their brain. Their amygdala is right about here, just to give you a sense of it again. The amygdala is this blue part here, so you can see that it's kind of related. And what they would do is, while this patient has these electrodes implanted in their amygdala, they would just ask them to give, literally, it's really simple, emotional ratings. So how much joy do you feel? How much anxiety? How much disdain, surprise, happiness? Just at any given moment, we're gonna, turn things on your brain. We just want you to tell us how you're feeling. And so in the white box that I'm gonna show you in a second, the white bars rather are gonna be before you stimulate the amygdala, and the black bars are after the stimulation. So you can see the difference in their emotions before and after. And so what you can see is there are a couple of differences. The biggest one for sure is that your feelings of fear go up, your feelings of anxiety go up, your feelings of sadness go up a little bit, your feelings of joy, they seem to go down. A lot of other feelings, they don't seem to change: disdain, disgust, surprise, so forth. Happiness is trending in that downward direction, but it's not exactly statistically significant. So you can see now this is a part of your brain that you can change the feelings that a person is feeling. The feelings that a person is feeling? Yeah, that works, whatever. The feelings that a person is feeling just by activating a part of their brain a little bit more. Their sense of joy, their sense of happiness, their sense of anger, fear, anxiety can all fluctuate. There are other regions, there are other studies. If you're curious, you could look into a region in the brain. It's called like the insula. It's involved in disgust. If you stimulate it, people will feel disgust and so on and so forth. But this is what happens if you stimulate the amygdala. Okay, so this is why I kind of wanted to dig into the amygdala, is to talk to you about what happens if you destroy the amygdala, okay? So there's a very, very, very famous patient in the literature. Her name is SM. She's a woman. I actually met her once. And she suffered from a disorder called Urbach-Witte disease. It's a German-named disease. And what it effectively does is it calcifies the amygdala. The amygdala has its own genetic signature. And so it actually turns out that you can have a genetic disorder that targets that gene sequence. And basically here you can see there are these little sort of like dark spots in the brain. That's where the amygdala should be gray matter healthy, but instead it's been calcified. What do you think happens if you have Urbach-Witte disease like SM? You would experience no fear, okay? She has a complete neuropathological inability to feel fear of any variety, okay? If you give her really huge spiders, big hairy tarantulas, other people get nervous and tense and anxious. She gets curious, she gets interested, she never gets frightened. You could even lie to her if you wanted, though it'd be kind of unethical. Tell her it's a venomous spider and that she's in danger, and she'd still be kind of excited and intrigued by it. One of my favorite aspects about her, and this has really been routinely reported, is that she's frequently described by people as being coquettish and flirty. She is in no way shy. She really likes to get to know people. She's very interested in them. When I was at a conference, actually, that's why I met her. She was at a conference. A couple of people who didn't know this aspect about her, they were like, gosh, like men and women alike were like, gosh, SM, she is quite the little flirt. She really goes for it, right? And I had to kind of tell them like, yeah, you do know that's like thought to be part of her disease, right? And the idea again is that what makes people a little standoffish, a little frightened, a little social phobic is increases in anxiety in the amygdala. Interestingly enough, she actually also gets herself in unsafe situations relatively often. She's been held at both gunpoint and knife point. And again, it just seems to go and show you how emotions dictate a lot of the choices we make, because yeah, rationally, she's a smart woman. She understands maybe don't go down this alley. But if you're not afraid, you're like, let's risk it. I'm sure it'll be fine. And as you can imagine, like, why do you sometimes make the decisions you make? We all make maybe not the best decisions sometimes, but sometimes it's just a gut feeling of like, come on, let's go for it. We'll break this rule. We'll go over the speed limit, things like this. And it's those emotions that kind of drive those decisions. And so without that kind of emotional signal saying you should be afraid, she can get herself in situations a lot. But here's what's super fascinating about her. It's not only does she not feel fear herself, she can't recognize fear in other people's faces. So you can show her pictures of faces conveying different emotions. And if you see with controls, we're all pretty good at it. She's pretty good at it unless it's a frightened face. If you show her a face that is frightened, a person kind of going like that, she's like, oh my gosh, like, what are they? Are they surprised? Are they confused? Are they disgusted? She has a really hard time processing that feeling that she herself can't feel. She also, this is true with fearful sounds. If she hears a person laughing, she knows they're happy. If she hears a person crying, she knows they're sad. If she hears a person screaming in fear, she's like, oh my gosh, are they confused? Sorry, what are they? But she can comprehend fear in the sense of describing situations that would frighten people. So she does understand being on a roller coaster is frightening. Being attacked is frightening. When somebody jumps out, it is frightening. But she herself just doesn't feel those emotions herself. So it's just like that's been gone away. Interestingly enough, they're actually, this disorder came and afflicted her, oh gosh, I can't remember how old she was, 5, 6, 8, 10. She was a young girl. So she can remember feeling afraid, but she's just like, oh yeah, I remember this one time I like jumped off a trampoline, and as I was cruising to hit the ground, weird word, whatever. As I was falling to hit the ground, I got very frightened and my heart was beating. And I was so terrified what was going to happen when I hit the ground. I haven't felt that way in years. And that's, I think, a situation that you can kind of understand, because imagine I was just like, if I'd asked all of you, what was like the worst physical pain you've ever felt in your life? You can remember it, but that doesn't mean you're feeling it now. The worst physical pain I ever felt was one time a pot of boiling water got knocked off the stove and it fell on my legs when I was a little boy. And I got like 2nd-degree burns all over my right leg. And I can remember it. I knew I can talk about what it felt like to experience that back in the past, but it doesn't mean I'm feeling it now. I can't conjure up that pain. That's exactly what's going on with this SM. She remembers these feelings, but she herself cannot experience them now. So the amygdala is probably the most well-studied of the regions that are involved in particular emotions. There, like I said, there's regions involved in things like disgust and anger and so on and so forth. And so I wanted to spend a little bit of time in particular talking about it before talking about emotions in general, because it's easily like emotional neuroscience 101. So that was a short video, but let's take a little break, and then when we come back, we'll talk about emotions more broadly.